Hello and welcome to this episode of the Academic Papers Podcast, where we celebrate academia and bring education to everyone.
Absolutely.
Today we're taking a deep dive into a research paper that asks a really intriguing question.
Okay.
How can we be sure that the information companies put out there, especially in those reports that aren't always formally audited, is actually trustworthy?
Yeah, it's a vital question in today's business world.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking about things like annual reports, quarterly updates, sustainability reports,
Right.
all those documents investors and the public rely on to make informed decisions.
Exactly. And the paper we're diving into is titled Disclosure of Processes to Verify the Integrity of Periodic Corporate Reports. It comes from the Deakin Integrated Reporting Center at Deakin University.
Okay.
And what's really fascinating is that it looks at Australia's top 300 listed companies, those on the ASX 300.
That's right. This research team, led by Professor Peter Carey, wanted to see how these companies are ensuring the accuracy of their reports, even when an external auditor isn't necessarily looking over their shoulder.
And why is this research particularly relevant now?
Well, back in 2019, following some high-profile corporate scandals, the ASX Australia's primary stock exchange updated its corporate governance recommendations. One of the key additions was Recommendation 4.3, which essentially urges companies to be more transparent about how they double-check their work.
So this paper is like a checkup, seeing how companies are responding to that call for greater transparency.
Exactly. And they've analyzed data from 2021, 2022, and 2023, which allows us to spot some interesting trends.
Okay, let's hear about those trends. What are some of the key findings?
The good news is that more companies are taking some steps to verify their reports compared to previous years.
Okay.
And this is a big but a significant portion of companies still aren't doing anything at all.
That's a bit concerning. What could explain that lack of action?
It does raise some questions. Are they just overlooking this recommendation? Are they concerned about what a deeper dive might reveal? It's difficult to say without further investigation.
It definitely highlights the need for continued scrutiny. What about the companies that are taking action?
Right.
Are they doing a good job of it?
There's a definite shift towards using multiple checks instead of just one,
Okay.
which at first glance seems like a positive development. Companies are realizing that ensuring accuracy requires a more robust approach.
More layers of verification.
Exactly.
Yeah.
However, here's where things get really interesting. Fewer companies are actually being specific about which reports they're verifying. They say they're doing checks, but don't tell us exactly what they're checking.
That seems like a pretty significant loophole, like saying you've proofread a document but not specifying which chapters.
That's a great analogy. And it makes it harder for investors and stakeholders to assess the reliability of the information they're receiving. If a company says it verifies its sustainability report but doesn't detail the process, how can we be sure it's a thorough check?
So transparency is key, not just in having these verification processes, but in clearly communicating what those processes are and what they cover.
Absolutely. Now, to understand these verification processes, the researchers used a framework called the 3 lines of defense. Think of it as a way to categorize the different methods companies use to ensure accuracy.
Okay, let's break down these lines of defense. What's the first line all about?
The first line focuses on internal controls. These are checks that happen within the company itself. It could be something as simple as having a manager review a report or comparing figures to source documents.
So built-in checks at the operational level.
Exactly. And the research found some interesting differences here. Smaller companies tend to rely more heavily on senior executives for these internal checks, while larger companies have a wider range of methods.
That makes sense. Larger companies, more resources, more specialized departments.
Now, the second line of defense is board oversight. This is where the company's board of directors gets involved. They oversee those internal checks, adding an extra layer of scrutiny.
So not just relying on one person or one department?
Right. It's about bringing in a higher level of authority and accountability. And we're seeing a positive trend here with more companies combining board oversight with those initial internal controls.
So 2 lines of defense working together. What about the third line?
The third line of defense is external assurance. This is where a company brings in an independent third party to verify the accuracy of their reports.
So kind of like an audit, but for reports that aren't typically subject to a full-blown audit.
Precisely. It's an extra layer of credibility. And while it's not as common as the first 2 lines of defense, its adoption is steadily increasing, especially with the rise of sustainability reporting and the growing demand for assurance in that area.
It sounds like companies are slowly realizing that when it comes to information that impacts investors and the public, a single check might not be enough. Now, before we move on to part 2 of this deep dive, I'd like to introduce our listeners to the lead researcher behind this paper, Professor Peter Carey.
Okay.
He has an incredibly impressive background in accounting, auditing, and corporate governance.
He really is a leader in the field. His work has been published in some of the most prestigious academic journals, and he brings a wealth of both theoretical knowledge and practical experience to his research. What I find particularly interesting is his work focusing on small and medium-sized enterprises, or SMEs, as well as not-for-profit organizations.
That's a great point. It shows that these issues of transparency and accountability aren't just relevant for big corporations. They're important for organizations of all sizes and across different sectors. We'll be back soon with part 2, where we'll delve into some real-world examples of companies doing a great job with their disclosures as well as some industry-specific trends. But for now, if you're interested in learning more about Professor Carey and his work, you can find his bio and publications on academicjobs.com. Just search for his name, and you'll be able to explore his impressive contributions to the field.
Welcome back. Before we jump back into the findings of the report, I think it's worth taking a moment to consider the broader context of Professor Carey's work.
I agree. It's not every day we get to peek inside the mind of a leading academic like him.
Exactly. And what's striking about Professor Carey is that he doesn't just stay within the ivory tower. He's a chartered accountant, a registered company auditor. He brings real-world experience to his academic research.
It's like having a bridge between the theoretical and the practical. That's got to be incredibly valuable, especially in a field like accounting, where the rules and practices are constantly evolving.
Absolutely. And his research interests highlight another crucial point. These issues of transparency and accountability aren't just limited to big corporations. His work with SMEs and not-for-profit organizations shows that these principles are relevant across all sectors.
It's a reminder that good governance isn't just a buzzword. It's a fundamental principle that applies to any organization, handling money and making decisions that impact others.
Precisely. Now let's shift our focus back to the research paper and delve into some of the specific findings. The paper highlights some companies that are doing an exceptional job with their disclosures. These are the organizations that aren't just ticking boxes, but demonstrating a real commitment to transparency.
Let's hear about these best practice examples. What makes them stand out?
Take Quabe Holdings Limited, for instance. They go above and beyond in terms of clarity and detail. They don't just say they're verifying their reports. They provide a meticulous breakdown of who checks what for each specific report.
So it's not just about saying you're doing the work, it's about showing your work.
Exactly. And they even go so far as to highlight how they ensure compliance with environmental reporting regulations, demonstrating a clear commitment to accountability in that area as well.
It's like they're saying, we've got nothing to hide. Here's exactly how we ensure the information we're putting out there is reliable.
Precisely. Another great example is Infomedia Limited. They use a clear table format to outline their 3-level review process, making it incredibly easy for anyone to understand how their reports are verified.
That's a fantastic example of how companies can make potentially complex information accessible and digestible.
And then we have Integral Diagnostics. They not only have a multi-level review process, but they also engage independent assurance for some of their reports, adding that extra layer of credibility.
They're really setting the bar high for transparency and accountability.
They are, and hopefully their example will inspire other companies to follow suit. Now, the paper also takes a look at disclosure practices across different industries, and some interesting trends emerge.
Well, I'm curious about this. Are there certain industries that are doing a better job than others when it comes to transparency?
There are. Consistently, industries like consumer staples, communication services, and healthcare tend to have the most robust and detailed disclosures.
What do you think drives that trend in those particular industries?
Well, if you think about it, these are all industries where consumer trust and reputation are paramount. Companies in these sectors know that their success relies heavily on maintaining that trust and transparency is a key component of that.
It's like they understand that clear, open communication is a crucial part of building and maintaining strong relationships with their customers and stakeholders.
Exactly. On the other end of the spectrum, we tend to see less detailed disclosures from capital-intensive industries like energy and utilities.
That's interesting. Any thoughts on why that might be the case?
It's difficult to say for sure. It could be that they face less public scrutiny, or perhaps their operating environment already involves stringent reporting requirements. However, as investors and stakeholders, it's important to be aware of these industry trends. They can provide valuable insights into a company's overall commitment to transparency and accountability.
It's like a signal to pay closer attention and perhaps ask more questions. Now, one of the most concerning findings of this research is the declining number of companies that specify which unaudited reports they're actually verifying.
That's a crucial point. They might say they're doing checks, but if they don't tell us what they're checking, it raises serious questions about the effectiveness of those checks. How can we assess the comprehensiveness of their verification processes if we don't even know which reports are being scrutinized?
It's like claiming to have cleaned your house but refusing to say which rooms you actually tackled.
A perfect analogy. And this goes back to the core principle of transparency. It's not enough to just go through the motions of verification. Companies need to be clear and specific about what they're doing and how they're doing it.
So checking the boxes isn't enough. They need to show us what's inside the boxes. Now, I know the research team used the 3 lines of defense framework to analyze these verification processes. Could you remind us what that entails?
Of course. It's a model for categorizing the different layers of checks and balances that companies use to ensure the integrity of the reports.
Yeah.
Imagine it like a layered security system for information.
I like that analogy.
Okay.
Walk us through these layers.
The first line of defense is all about internal controls. These are the checks that happen within the company itself. Think of it as having built-in safeguards at the operational level. Things like managerial reviews, comparing figures to source documents, making sure things are reconciled and match up.
So catching errors and inconsistencies before they even leave the department.
Exactly. The second line of defense is board oversight. This brings in the company's board of directors, adding a higher level of authority and accountability.
So it's not just one person or department responsible. It goes all the way up to the board.
Right. The board is responsible for overseeing those internal controls, ensuring they're robust and effective. And the research shows that companies are increasingly using board oversight in conjunction with those initial internal controls.
That makes sense. 2 lines of defense working together to ensure accuracy.
Yeah.
What about that third line of defense?
The third line of defense is external assurance. This involves bringing in an independent third party to verify the accuracy of the reports. It's like an independent audit, but for reports that aren't typically subject to a full-blown audit.
So an extra layer of scrutiny from someone outside the company, providing that impartial perspective.
Exactly. And while it's not yet as common as the first 2 lines of defense, the use of external assurance is steadily increasing, particularly with the growing focus on sustainability reporting and the need for greater credibility in that area.
It seems like companies are starting to realize that when it comes to information that impacts investors, the public, and the planet, a single check might not be enough. Now, before we wrap up part 2, I wanted to highlight something you mentioned earlier about Professor Carey's work with the not-for-profit sector.
Absolutely. It's a crucial point. These issues of transparency and accountability aren't limited to the corporate world. Nonprofits also have a responsibility to be transparent about their finances and operations, especially when they're handling public donations.
They're entrusted with funds meant for a specific purpose. So it's even more critical that they operate with transparency and integrity.
Precisely. Professor Carey's research in this area underscores how the principles of good governance apply across all types of organizations. It doesn't matter if you're a multinational corporation or a local charity, the need for clear communication, robust verification processes, and accountability remains the same.
It's about fostering a culture of integrity, regardless of the organization's size or mission. We'll be back soon with part 3. Where we'll explore the implications of this research for the future of corporate reporting and what it means for investors, companies, and society as a whole. But first, a quick reminder that you can learn more about Professor Peter Carey and his work on academicjobs.com. Just search for his name, and you'll find his bio and a list of his publications. It's a great resource for anyone interested in exploring the world of academic research in accounting and corporate governance.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the world of corporate transparency.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground.
We have.
From the increasing use of multiple checks to verify information to that concerning trend of companies being less transparent about exactly which reports are subject to those checks.
Alright.
And we've explored how these issues of transparency and accountability are relevant not just for big corporations, but for organizations of all sizes, including SMEs and not-for-profits.
It's been a fascinating journey, hasn't it? And it really underscores the crucial role that research like Professor Carey's plays in shedding light on these evolving trends and helping us understand what good governance looks like in practice.
It does. And speaking of Professor Carey, before we wrap up this deep dive, I wanted to mention something I found particularly interesting in his bio on academicjobs.com.
Okay.
He's clearly passionate about making academic research accessible and relevant to the real world.
That's so important. It's not enough for research to just sit on a shelf in a library. It needs to be shared, discussed, and applied to real-world challenges.
Exactly. And Professor Carey embodies that commitment to bridging the gap between academia and practice. He's not just publishing in top academic journals, he's also engaging with practitioners, policymakers, and the public to ensure his research has a tangible impact.
It's inspiring to see academics who are so dedicated to making a difference beyond the confines of the university. Now, as we conclude this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with a thought-provoking question. In this age of information overload, what responsibility do companies have to make their reports not only accurate but easily understandable for everyone?
That's a great question. We're bombarded with information from all directions these days. It's a constant struggle to filter through it all and figure out what's reliable and what's not.
Exactly. And when it comes to corporate reporting, it's not enough for companies to just be accurate. They need to be clear, concise, and accessible. They need to think about their audience and present information in a way that's easy to understand, even for those who aren't financial experts.
It's about empowering stakeholders to make informed decisions.
Yeah.
And that requires a commitment to communication that goes beyond simply complying with regulations.
It's about seeing transparency not as a burden, but as an opportunity to build trust and credibility. And ultimately, that benefits everyone.
Well said. So it's a call to action for both companies and individuals. Companies need to embrace transparency as a core value, and individuals need to be proactive in seeking out information and demanding accountability. Knowledge is power, but only if we can access it and understand it.
Couldn't agree more. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of corporate reporting and integrity. It's been a pleasure exploring these important issues with you.
And to our listeners, we encourage you to explore the source material for yourselves. You can find a link to the full research paper on our website. We also encourage you to delve deeper into Professor Peter Carey's work. You can find his bio and a list of his publications on academicjobs.com. Just search for his name, and you'll be able to explore his impressive contributions to the field. Until next time, stay curious and keep learning.